March 23rd, 1943, 0400 hours. The high plateau east of El Guettar, Tunisia. General Fritz von Broich of the German 10th Panzer Division sat in his command car and listened to the sound of his tanks rolling into position. 50 serviceable panzers, about 6,000 men, a company of tank destroyers, an assault gun battery. The terrain was open, the pre-dawn air was cold and still, and he had every reason in the world to believe that the next few hours would be a rout. Because Fritz von Broich had done this before. 5 weeks earlier, in February, German forces had torn through American positions in a series of battles that culminated at the Kasserine Pass. They had destroyed 183 American tanks. They had captured more than 3,000 American soldiers. They had inflicted 6,000 casualties on a force that ran at almost every turn. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had described the Americans as inexperienced amateurs. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had expected the campaign to end with Tunis in German hands. Senior British officers, including General Montgomery and Field Marshal Alexander, had concluded privately that the Americans were hopelessly trained and led. British soldiers in the line had taken to calling the Americans "our Italians." And now, at El Guettar, von Broich was looking across open ground at the same American unit he had beaten 5 weeks earlier, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, Terry Allen's men. He expected the same result. What he got was something else entirely. By 10 in the morning, as the sun climbed over the Tunisian plateau, von Broich's tanks had run into a minefield that had not been there 5 weeks before. His panzers, slowed to clear the field, came under fire from carefully positioned anti-tank guns. American M10 tank destroyers of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged them from positions his reconnaissance had missed. American artillery dropped concentrated fire on his armor with a coordination his scouts had not detected. Within roughly 1 hour, 30 of his 50 tanks were burning in the open. By midday, the 10th Panzer Division was retreating from a valley it had expected to own by lunch. Von Broich did not understand what had happened. The captured documents confirmed it was the same division, the same numbered regiments, many of the same officers. The big red one he had beaten at Kasserine, and the big red one he was facing at El Guettar carried the same patches, the same unit histories, the same names on the rolls, but they were not the same army. This would happen again, in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. The pattern became so common that German officers in post-war interrogations returned to a single word to describe it: unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They had beaten an American unit 1 week and faced what they swore was a different army the next. They could not understand where that speed of adaptation came from. They could not locate the source of it. They could not, despite every attempt, replicate it. What Fritz von Broich was witnessing that morning was not luck. It was not accident. It was the first visible result of a system that had been quietly built in the United States Army over the previous 15 years. A system the Germans did not know existed. A system that, when it finally reached full speed in 1944, would turn American infantry divisions into the fastest learning fighting organizations in modern military history. To understand why von Broich's tanks burned at El Guettar, and why Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division would be annihilated in Normandy 18 months later, we need to go back to something the Germans had that the Americans did not. And then we need to look at what the Americans built that the Germans could never copy. Part 1. For most of the 20th century, if you asked any serious student of war which army in the world was the best at tactics, you would get the same answer. Not the Americans, not the British, the Germans. This was not propaganda, it was professional consensus. Since the wars of Prussian unification in the 1860s, the German army had refined a tradition of tactical excellence that every other modern military studied. They had a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, which gave subordinate commanders the authority to adapt their methods to achieve their commander's intent, without waiting for orders. They had the best non-commissioned officer corps in the world. Their field regulations were translated and studied at West Point, Sandhurst, and Saint-Cyr. Between 1939 and 1941, the Wehrmacht had defeated Poland in 5 weeks, France and the Low Countries in 6 weeks, and the Balkans in under a month. Entire armies had surrendered to German combined arms operations that seemed to operate at a speed the defenders could not process. The United States Army, by contrast, was barely an army at all. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the U.S. Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men. It ranked below Portugal. Its infantry still drilled with equipment from the First World War. Its tactical doctrine, laid out in field manuals that hadn't been meaningfully revised in 2 decades, was built around the trench warfare of 1918. Its armor doctrine assumed that tanks would never fight other tanks. Its air-ground coordination was, in the words of one observer, essentially non-existent. When General George C. Marshall took over as Chief of Staff in September 1939, he inherited a force that most European officers privately considered a joke. In 1941, the Army ran the largest peacetime maneuvers in its history, the Louisiana maneuvers, nearly 500,000 men. It was a mess. Combined arms coordination failed at every level. Tank units lost contact with their infantry. Artillery fell out of range. Radio discipline broke down. Generals who looked strong on paper collapsed under the stress of moving large formations across complicated terrain. The maneuvers did not prove the U.S. Army was ready for war. They proved the opposite. And yet, something happened during those maneuvers that would turn out to matter more than anyone realized at the time. Marshall watched. So did his key subordinates. And what they took away from Louisiana was not a set of tactical lessons. It was a conclusion about process. The U.S. Army, they decided, could not afford to train the way European armies trained. It did not have a long institutional memory. It did not have a tradition of tactical excellence stretching back a century. What it could afford, and what it would have to build, was a mechanism for learning faster than anyone else. A system that would take the lessons of one unit in one battle and feed them into every other unit before the next battle. In 1941, that was still just an idea. In November 1942, it faced its first real test, Operation Torch, the American landing in North Africa. The early results were everything the Germans expected. By the time American forces reached Tunisia in early 1943, the weaknesses Marshall had seen at Louisiana were on full display. American armor was dispersed instead of concentrated. Anti-tank doctrine was built around a weapon category, the tank destroyer, that assumed the enemy would cooperate by attacking at predictable points. Infantry and tanks rarely worked together. Air support was slow and poorly coordinated. And at the top of the American command structure in Tunisia sat Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man who spent more time in his underground bunker than at the front, issuing orders in a personal slang that his own subordinates sometimes could not decipher. On February 14th, 1943, at Sidi Bouzid, the Germans attacked. The U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A was sent in piecemeal. German anti-tank guns and panzers destroyed them in sequence. The Americans lost more than 160 tanks in a single day. By February 19th, at the Kasserine Pass itself, American positions had collapsed. By February 22nd, the Americans had lost ground equal to a distance greater than they would lose in any single week of the entire war, including the Battle of the Bulge. Rommel assessed it and concluded, as he would later write, that the Americans had not yet learned their lessons. The British commanders around him agreed. The Germans around him agreed. There was exactly one person in a senior position who looked at Kasserine and drew a different conclusion: General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a private letter to Marshall, written within days of the disaster, Eisenhower said, "All of our people, from the very highest to the very lowest, have learned that this is not a child's game." And a few days after that, in another letter, "We're learning something every day, and in general do not make the same mistake twice." The Germans heard nothing of this. They had no reason to believe an American general's private correspondence. They had evidence of their eyes. An American force had been routed. Their own historical experience told them that green armies recovered slowly, if at all. The British required nearly 3 years of defeat before their army learned to beat the Germans. The Russians had spent 18 months paying catastrophic prices for their learning. The Americans would pay the same price for the same lessons over the same span of time. That was the German assumption on February 23, 1943. It was wrong by March 23rd. And in the 5 weeks between those two dates, something happened in the American Army that the Germans would spend the rest of the war trying to understand. Part 2. What happened in those 35 days was not magic. It was machinery. A machinery of learning that had been quietly assembled in the United States since the middle of 1942, and that was now running at a speed the Germans did not even know to measure. Start with the paper. On June 18, 1942, the War Department's Military Intelligence Service issued the first of a series of bulletins called Tactical and Technical Trends. Every 2 weeks, a new issue went out. Reports from American military attachés in every theater of war, reports from observers embedded with British forces in North Africa and with Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, analyses of captured German equipment, translations of German and Japanese training manuals, interviews with Allied soldiers who had fought German units. 40 bulletins, more than 2,000 pages, all of them disseminated down through the Army's training establishments by the end of 1943. No other army in the war ran anything quite like it at that scale. The Germans had intelligence summaries, yes, but they were classified and limited in distribution. The British had their own analysis efforts, but lacked the American printing and distribution infrastructure. The Soviets ran theirs on a much narrower front. Then came the combat lessons pamphlets. The first one was published in early 1944 under the title Combat Lessons Number 1, Rank and File in Combat. What they're doing, how they do it. It was not a field manual. It was not signed by a general. It was a collection of short, specific, practical observations from individual American soldiers who had recently been in combat. A sergeant describing how his squad had handled a machine gun nest in Sicily, a tank commander explaining why he'd ordered a particular maneuver near Salerno, a forward observer reporting a technique for adjusting artillery fire on moving German armor. 9 issues were published between 1944 and 1945. They were printed in enormous runs and distributed down to the company level across every theater. The Germans had nothing like this. Their doctrine said that insight belonged to commanders. The idea of asking a sergeant to explain his own tactical innovation, then printing it and sending it to every other sergeant in the Army, would have struck a German staff officer as an inversion of how a professional military was supposed to work. Then came the Army Ground Forces Observer Board. Officers sent by General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, specifically to ride with combat units, record what worked and what didn't, and then fly back to the United States to brief replacement training centers. Hundreds of these reports were produced. Report number 4, 1-3 on defense against mortars. Report number 4, 150 on Pathfinder teams in Operation Market Garden. Report number 5, 159 on anti-tank weapons from the 2nd Infantry Division. Every one of them fed back into the training pipeline at Fort Benning, Fort Sill, Fort Knox, Camp Blanding. And underneath all of this ran the quieter, constant layer of the American system, the after-action report. Every American unit, after every significant engagement, produced one. Not filed and forgotten, collected, analyzed, excerpts redistributed, lessons extracted. The material for the next revision of the next training cycle. The cycle time of this machinery was something no other army had achieved. A battle happened. Within days, survivors produced a report. Within weeks, the report was read by observers at a higher headquarters. Within a month, the observations were excerpted into a bulletin. Within 6 to 8 weeks, the bulletin reached a replacement training center in Texas or Georgia. The training curriculum changed, and the next shipment of replacements, arriving at the front a few weeks later, arrived carrying the lessons of the unit they were replacing. That was the feedback loop. That was what the Germans could not see and could not copy. Now return to Kasserine. Within 48 hours of the battle's conclusion, Eisenhower acted. Fredendall was out. Major General George S. Patton was in. Major General Ernest N. Harmon had already been quietly sent to Second Corps headquarters as what Eisenhower had called a useful senior assistant, with secret orders to report back on what was broken. Brigadier General Lawrence Cooter was brought forward to systematize air-ground coordination under new procedures that would become standard doctrine. Major General Omar Bradley arrived to report directly on the command failures and would stay on as Deputy Corps Commander. The doctrinal lessons of Kasserine, meanwhile, were moving through the machinery at speeds the Germans would not have believed possible. The dispersal of armor into small combat commands was identified as a central error. Anti-tank positioning doctrine was revised. Minefield employment was tightened. Artillery fire control, already in the process of being centralized through Fort Sill's Fire Direction Center system, was pushed closer to its design potential. And critically, the 1st Infantry Division itself, Terry Allen's Big Red One, spent the intervening weeks reviewing every unit-level after-action report and drilling the corrections. The Germans did not know any of this was happening. They had their own intelligence picture, their own assumptions about how fast green armies could improve, their own confidence in the superiority of their tactical system. Men like Terry Allen and Ted Roosevelt Jr. didn't fight for glory, and they didn't fight for headlines. They fought because somebody had to pick up the pieces after Kasserine and turn a shaken division into an army that could kill panzers. Every like on this video helps their story reach the people who care about how that actually got done. It cost nothing. It matters. By March 23, 1943, when Fritz von Broisch's tanks rolled forward at Guettar, the 1st Infantry Division was not the division that had been beaten at Kasserine. Not on paper, not in doctrine, not in the heads of the men pulling the triggers on the M10 tank destroyers of the 601st. It was the same patch, same regimental numbers, same division commander, different army. Von Broisch saw the result. He did not see the cause. And the question he and every other German commander could not answer was the question this entire video is about. Where exactly did that transformation happen? What was the mechanism? And why, despite every effort, could the German army not build the same thing? The answer starts in the 5 weeks between Kasserine and Guettar, but it runs all the way through the war. Part 3. To see the machinery at work, look at one division in one 5-week stretch. The 1st Infantry Division, February 22, 1943 to March 23, 1943. On February 22nd, as the German offensive at Kasserine finally ran out of steam, the Big Red One had been battered but not destroyed. Its Combat Team 16 and Combat Team 18 had taken serious casualties. Some of its supporting artillery units had been overrun. Its confidence was shaken. The division's commander, Major General Terry Allen, was a World War I veteran of the Meuse Argonne, a polo player, a cavalry officer by training, and a man who swore like a private and drank like a cavalry officer from Central Casting. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the president, had landed at Arzew on November 8, 1942, reading Kipling from memory on the transport. Neither of them was going to change who they were. But what they did in those 5 weeks changed. Within days of Kasserine's end, the division's artillery began re-registering its batteries under the centralized Fire Direction Center doctrine that had been refined at Fort Sill in the 1930s, but had not been fully employed in combat at Kasserine. Gun positions were moved to support each other. Forward observers were pushed down to platoon level, with universal map coordinates drilled to automatic use. The anti-tank gun positioning was overhauled. At Kasserine, American anti-tank guns had been placed forward, visible and often isolated. The new doctrine, absorbed from British experience and from the first hard American lessons, called for guns positioned in depth, sighted in on likely approach routes and mutually supporting. Minefields, which had not been a serious feature of the Kasserine defense, became a planning priority. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with new M10 tank destroyers, drilled its gunnery under conditions meant to simulate the kind of German armored attack that had chewed up American positions at Sidi Bouzid. They practiced firing from defilade, shifting positions after every engagement, and working under the direction of forward observers. Air-ground coordination was tightened. At Kasserine, American aircraft had been largely absent from the critical battles. Brigadier General Lawrence Guettar, newly installed as Air Support Commander, developed the direct support procedures that would be used for the rest of the war in Europe. Liaison officers were embedded with ground units. Request procedures were simplified. Response times were cut. Patton, meanwhile, did what Patton did. He walked into the Second Corps area on March 6th and started firing men, finding soldiers without helmets and neckties, and reviewing every unit in his command. His exact relationship with Terry Allen was complicated. The two argued frequently, but Patton left the 1st Infantry Division essentially alone, because he recognized what Allen was doing. On March 23rd at El Guettar, the 10th Panzer Division under von Broich attacked at dawn. Their own reconnaissance had reported that the American defense was thin. They expected to break through to El Guettar itself by midday. What they met was a defense built on every lesson absorbed since February 22nd. They hit a minefield at El Kadab that stopped them cold. American forward observers called in artillery concentrations from gun positions that had pre-registered the likely attack corridors. When the German armor tried to bypass the minefield, they ran into M10 tank destroyers of the 601st, firing from defilade with the confidence of men who had drilled the situation for 3 weeks. Within about an hour of the opening engagement, 30 of the 10th Panzer's 50 panzers were burning. The American 1st Infantry lost 22 of its own tanks and took significant casualties, including heavy losses in the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. But the German attack broke. By noon, von Broich was pulling back. Rommel, by this point reassigned and preparing to leave Africa for good, reviewed the reports and later wrote, "The Americans had fought brilliantly." He added, with a grace not always associated with him, that the Americans had made up for their lack of experience with far better and more plentiful equipment and their tactically more flexible command. That phrase, tactically more flexible command, mattered. Rommel had noticed, without quite being able to name it, that the Americans at El Guettar were operating at a tempo they had not been able to achieve at Kasserine. Decisions were being made faster. Units were coordinating more smoothly. The gap between a report arriving at a command post and a response going out to the field had shrunk. He did not know why. He did not understand the machinery. He could see the result. What the Germans could not grasp was that the 1st Infantry Division at El Guettar was not a better division because it had received better men or better equipment. Its personnel rosters were largely unchanged. Its tanks were, on paper, worse than the panzers they faced. What had changed was the volume and the speed of the information flowing through its system. The after-action reports from Sidi Bouzid had been absorbed. The doctrinal lessons from Kasserine had been drilled. The observations from British officers who had fought Rommel for 2 years had been passed down and practiced. This was the first time in the war the American machinery fully worked in combat. It would not be the last. Hans von Luck, a veteran German panzer officer who had fought in France, North Africa, and Russia, would later write in his memoirs that the Americans adapted immediately to a changed situation and fought with great doggedness. Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of the 48th Panzer Corps in Russia, and later a division commander in the West, would put it differently in his post-war interviews. He said of the Americans, and he did not mean it as a compliment, "They are masses and we are individuals." He was describing something real, but he had the moral of it wrong. The masses he was talking about were learning collectively, through a system that pumped lessons from every individual soldier into every other individual soldier. The individuals he admired were learning alone, because German doctrine and German political culture no longer permitted honest reporting to flow freely from the bottom up. By the time Mellenthin made that comment, the American system had already broken the Wehrmacht's best, and it was about to do it again, faster, in a place von Broich had never heard of. Part 4. If Kasserine to El Guettar had taken 35 days, Normandy would see the same kind of transformation happen in 11. Jump ahead 15 months. June 1944. The largest amphibious operation in history puts almost 9 divisions of American infantry and armor ashore on the Normandy coast over the first week of Overlord. And almost immediately, those divisions slam into a terrain problem that nobody had seriously planned for: the bocage. For centuries, Norman farmers had enclosed their fields with earthen banks topped by dense hedgerows. Some of these banks were 10 feet high. Some of the hedges were impenetrable walls of thorn and root. The fields they enclosed were often only a few hundred yards across. And the Germans had moved into this landscape with a defensive doctrine that used every inch of it. Every hedge was a potential machine gun position. Every corner was a potential anti-tank ambush. Every field was a killing ground. American tanks could not get through. When they tried to ride over the hedgerows, their hulls tilted skyward and exposed their thinly armored bellies to German Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. Their own main guns pointed at the clouds instead of the enemy. American infantry casualties, moving across these small fields under observed fire, climbed to rates that alarmed the High Command. Panzer Lehr Division, under Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, the best-equipped armored division the Germans had in the West, was positioned to block the American breakout in the St. Lo sector. Bayerlein, who had been Rommel's chief of staff in Africa, knew his terrain and knew his enemy. He expected the Americans to grind through the bocage slowly with heavy casualties for weeks. The Americans had a different answer coming. It did not come from a general. It did not come from a staff officer. It came from a conversation in a 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron bivouac, where a group of tankers were talking about the hedgerow problem. According to the account later given by the military historian Max Hastings, one of the men, an enlisted soldier identified in the surviving record as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts, made a suggestion. "Why not put saw teeth on the front of the tank," he said, "and cut straight through the hedges?" Most of the men laughed. One of them didn't. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III, a 29-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry, 2nd Armored Division. Cullen went scavenging. He found scrap steel from German Czech hedgehog beach obstacles that had been strewn across Normandy to stop the Allied landings. He welded 4 tusk-like prongs to the front of a light tank. He tested it against a hedgerow. It worked. On July 14, 1944, Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding V Corps, came out to watch. General Omar Bradley arrived soon after. What Bradley saw is recorded in his own memoir. The tank, fitted with what looked like a crossbar bearing 4 tusk-like prongs, backed off, ran at a hedgerow at 10 miles an hour, and crashed through. A Sherman rigged the same way duplicated the performance. As Bradley wrote in A Soldier's Story, so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. The tusk-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., a 29-year-old sergeant. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel J.B. Medeiros, the Corps Ordnance Officer, was on the radio to every ordnance unit in 1st Army. The order was round-the-clock production. Scrap metal was collected from destroyed German beach obstacles up and down the invasion coast. Welding crews worked through the night. The clock started on July 14th. By July 25th, about 500 of the devices had been manufactured and installed. 3 out of every 5 American tanks in 1st Army were now fitted with what the troops were calling rhinos. In 11 days, from one sergeant's demonstration to the tools of an entire army. If you have served in the infantry, or if your father or grandfather served, I would be honored to hear about them in the comments. What unit did they fight with? Where did they land? The stories that never made it into the textbooks are sometimes the only honest record left. The generals have their memoirs. The privates mostly don't. Please share. Operation Cobra launched on the morning of July 25, 1944. Close to 1,800 American heavy bombers dropped an enormous carpet of explosives on the Panzer Lehr Division's positions. And then the American armor moved forward, with Cullen's devices cutting gaps through hedgerows that Panzer Lehr had thought would channel the attackers into German kill zones. Within hours, Bayerlein's division had lost most of its combat effectiveness. Within 2 days, the German defense along that sector had ruptured completely. Bayerlein's own description of what happened to his division was captured in a post-war interrogation. He described the bombardment as hell. He wrote of a front line that looked like a landscape of the moon. He put his personnel losses at roughly 70% dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. And then he added a sentence that touches the exact nerve of what this video is about. He said that he had been certain, going into the fight, that the Americans could not break the bocage defense quickly. He had expected the terrain to hold them for weeks. Instead, they had arrived at his line with a solution he had never seen before, and they had arrived with it on 3 out of every 5 of their tanks. Bayerlein had served with Rommel in Africa. He had commanded the Africa Corps in its final battles. He had seen the British take 3 years to learn how to beat the Germans, and he had now, in 11 days, seen an American army identify a terrain problem, invent a solution at the enlisted level, validate it, scale it across a field army, and launch it against him. He did not understand how that was possible, and this is the second time in this story that a senior German commander used some variation of the same word. Incomprehensible. The 10th Panzer Division had used it at El Guettar. The Panzer-Lehr Division was using it at St. Lo. Between those two moments, the American learning cycle had not slowed down. It had accelerated. Part 5 and verdict. The final question is the one the Germans never answered. Why couldn't they copy the American system? It was not a secret. The combat lessons pamphlets could be found in captured copies in German intelligence files by the summer of 1944. The tactical and technical trends bulletins were known to exist. German liaison officers on the Eastern Front had seen something similar, in rougher form, in Soviet combat reports by 1943. German staff officers after 1944 could describe the outlines of what the Americans were doing. They still could not build it. And the reason they could not build it had nothing to do with paper or printing or distribution. It had to do with three things that ran deeper than any military doctrine. The first was the question of whose observation counted. In the German tradition, tactical insight belonged to commanders. The word for what a good officer had was Fingerspitzengefühl, a kind of intuition, a feel in the fingertips for the terrain and the enemy. It was a virtue of the man, not a product of the system. When Mellenthin and Balck talked about it after the war, they used the language of individual genius. A good commander saw things his subordinates did not see. A good sergeant executed the commander's intent. The idea that a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey might be the source of the most important tactical innovation in Normandy, and that his name would appear in the official after-action record next to the general's, was not part of that tradition. It was not a question of talent. It was a question of who was permitted to have ideas. The second was the question of what could be honestly reported. American after-action reports could say, in writing, that a particular American attack had failed because of a specific tactical error, and that the error should be corrected in training. The report would be filed, read, and used. No one was punished for writing it. By contrast, German reporting in the later years of the war operated under the pressure of a political system that treated pessimism as defeatism and defeatism as a capital offense. Hitler had, by 1944, executed or fired enough senior commanders for reporting unpleasant truths that honest field reporting had largely dried up at the top. Down at the battalion level, German officers continued to record what they saw, and those records survive, but the vertical circulation of bad news into the training and doctrine system had been broken. Honest reporting was punished. Honest reporting was the fuel that made the American system run. The third was the question of speed. American industrial capacity could print the combat lessons pamphlets in enormous runs and distribute them to every company in every theater. American transport could move an observer from a Belgian foxhole to a classroom at Fort Benning in a week. American replacement training centers could retool their curriculum in days. By 1944, when the German army was beginning to lose the ability to move paper and men across its own interior lines, the American feedback loop was still accelerating. Put those three things together, and you have the answer Fritz von Broich could not find at El Guettar, and Fritz Bayerlein could not find at St. Lo. It was not that the Americans were smarter. It was not that their soldiers were braver, and it was certainly not the case that their tanks were better than the Panzers and Tigers they faced. It was that the American army had built a system in which the observation of a rifleman in a hedgerow in July reached a training instructor in Georgia by September, shaped a new curriculum by October, and came back to the front in the person of a replacement who arrived at the line by November. The same loop accelerated over and over 3 years of war. By the time Panzer-Lehr faced it in Normandy, American infantry divisions were learning roughly 10 times faster than their opponents. Mellenthin's post-war verdict, delivered as an insult, was accidentally the best description of what he had seen. They were masses, and his own soldiers were individuals. The masses had learned together. The individuals had learned alone. Circle back to the morning of March 23, 1943, on the high plateau east of El Guettar. Fritz von Broich sits in his command car. His tanks are beginning to burn in the open. He cannot see it yet, but the war is already decided. not by the panzers on fire in front of him, and not by the Americans dug in across the valley. It is decided by a mechanism he cannot see. A printing press in Washington, a training depot in Texas, a room in Fort Sill where firing tables are being revised, a sergeant in a New Jersey recruiting office who will be wearing a uniform by December, a feedback loop running every day in every theater, pulling lessons out of the dead and the wounded and pouring them back into the living. He does not understand it. Neither will Bayerling. Neither will any of them. They will fight the rest of the war against an army that is, in the most literal sense, a different army every week. The final verdict is this: the Germans lost the Second World War against the Western Allies, not because their soldiers were worse, and not because their equipment was worse. Unit for unit, man for man, German infantry and armor remained formidable into the last weeks of the fighting. What the Germans lost was the race of adaptation. They built their army around the idea that excellence came from individual genius, carefully cultivated over a career. The Americans built theirs around the idea that excellence came from a system that turned every engagement, every failure, every sergeant's bright idea into training material for everyone else. Over 3 years, the system beat the genius. Over 10 days in Normandy, it beat the genius faster. Curtis Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit. He later lost his left foot to a mine in the Hurtgen Forest. He died in Greenwich Village in 1963, largely unknown outside his hometown of Cranford, New Jersey. The sergeant from Tennessee named Roberts, whose original joke sparked the idea, disappears from the record entirely. They are not in most of the history books. They are not on the monuments. The generals have their statues. The privates and the sergeants mostly do not. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about getting the history right, not just the version that made it into the official narrative. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. Because the story of how an army of volunteer citizens, most of them serving for the first time in their lives, built a learning machine that outpaced the professional militaries of Europe is not over. It is still being taught, and it is still being forgotten. War is a system. The men who fought it were not numbers. They had names. Curtis Cullen had a name. Roberts of Tennessee had a name. Fritz von Broich watched his tanks burn at El Guettar because somewhere behind those American lines, a sergeant's observation from a week earlier had already reached the gunner on an M10. That is the sentence the German army never learned to write. And by the time they understood it, the war was already over.